Who is the main character of Dandadan? Most people will rightfully tell you that Momo and Okarun are both the main characters. But what most people can't tell you is why Tatsu decided to give Dandadan 2 lead characters. In other words, how is Dandadan any different from a show with 1 lead character like Chainsaw Man, or shows with several perspectives like Arcane? What makes having dual protagonists special is that it builds the story on the growing relationship between these 2 characters. While not inherently better than traditional stories, this trope makes Dandadan incredibly unique because it's a story of partnership, teamwork, and synergy. So in this video, I'd like to examine the rising trend in shows with dual protagonists like Soul Eater, discuss how Tatsu borrows from both romance manga and battle shonen, and explain how Dandadan shows us that 2 main characters is usually better than 1. Now, before I say anything else, let's just make sure we're clear. I might say dual main characters or 2 main characters interchangeably, but when I am talking about the trope we see in Dandadan, I am specifically talking about dual main characters. Specifically, any story where 2 main characters both lead the story together and each share the narrative focus. So this would not include something like, say, Gurren Lagann, because while it does have 2 lead characters, it's obvious that only one of them is really the main character. What makes Dandadan different from something like Gurren Lagann is that both main characters equally share the role of leading the story. You can see this in the very first chapter because although it starts with Momo, it ends with both characters working together. The takeaway is that the story is about both of these characters, and neither of them could achieve this kind of growth without the other. We see this when they team up against the Flatwoods monster, and again when they fight Turbo Granny. We also see this in the romance scenes, when we don't really focus on one character or the other. Like when Momo and Okarun are nervous about talking to each other, we jump back and forth between both characters. Now, obviously, the story isn't always about these 2. We do take time to flesh out other characters like Iroh or Gigi, but the overall narrative is led by these 2 characters, and they lead the story through their growing chemistry, hence why I refer to this trope as dual main characters. The story is defined by the growing relationship between Momo and Okarun, and how each of these characters influences the other. So Dandadan wouldn't be what it is today without both of these characters leading the story. But at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, I get it, 2 main characters is cool. But is it really any better than having just 1 main character? Like, is there really any difference? To answer your question, yes, there is. As a matter of fact, this trope is so special that you rarely see it done in other series. Well, maybe not in battle shonen like Dragon Ball or Jujutsu Kaisen, but it is fairly common in romance stories. And that's where we get into Tatsu's background in romance manga. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So, by now, you've probably heard that Tatsu read dozens and dozens of romance manga before he started Dandadan. It's also important to know that he had pitched dozens and dozens of action series to his editor before he was finally told to just draw whatever he wants. So when you look at Dandadan, it's important to keep in mind that it is the product of a strong desire to draw a big, exciting action series, but also a new passion for romance stories and their familiar tropes, which gives us some insight into the unique role of this dual main character role, because for the most part, it's usually a somewhat romantic dynamic. There are exceptions, like you could easily argue that JoJo Part 7 uses this trope with its 2 lead characters, but again, that's more of the exception. For the most part, romance usually plays a pretty big role in these types of stories because of the unique dynamic between the 2 main characters. As a matter of fact, Soul Eater is a great example of this. I never thought of it until now, but Soul Eater and Dandadan have more in common than you think. Soul and Maka's whole dynamic is built around being partners. In fact, The theme of partnership is one of the biggest themes in Soul Eater because a lot of the story revolves around the madness, and this idea that being alone leaves you vulnerable to self-doubt and anxiety, but having someone to share your problems with makes them more manageable. It's a recurring theme with just about every duo in the story. In fact, it's not uncommon for there to be romantic tension between some of these duos. Mary and Stein, obviously. Blackstar and Tsubaki have some romantic tension. And of course, Soul and Maka. It can be argued both ways, but at the very least, their relationship is defined by their mutual desire to grow on their own and protect each other. One of the best parts is how Maka wants to be strong so Soul doesn't have to rely on the madness. And Soul has this identity issue of thinking he needs to be, like the cool guy. It all comes down to scenes like when Soul is playing the piano and Maka respects him for his artistic talent rather than his cool guy attitude or his abilities. It's a great dynamic because we get to see how these characters help each other find their most authentic selves. The only problem with a series like Soul Eater is that Soul and Maka don't really carry the narrative focus. Like, they're clearly the main characters, but Soul Eater is as much about Blackstar and Tsubaki and Kid and the twins as much as it is about Soul and Maka. So while teamwork is a central theme, those two aren't the best example of a lead-in couple. Soul Eater is more akin to something like Arcane, where they are the main characters, so to speak, but the story has a handful of different perspectives, especially in Season 2. These kinds of shows are fun, but they're really no different than a show with just one main character. The only difference is you have multiple perspectives rather than just one. A better example would be something like Undead Unluck. Undead Unluck is led by Andy and Fuko. While their beginning is awkward, to say the least, they quickly become a romantic couple where they each push each other to grow. Andy pushes Fuko to believe in herself and be more confident, and she shows Andy that he doesn't have to fight alone. Andy does a lot of the fighting, but Fuko is really the one that inspires all of the other characters. In this sense, they share the role of leading the story, even if they do it in different ways. In fact, Fuko even takes over the fighting part later in the story, but I won't spoil that part for you. The reason I would say Undead Unluck is a better example of this is because of how it blends romance and action. Soul Eater is all about partnership, and there is a romantic undertone, but nobody would really call it a romance. Meanwhile, romance is a big part of Undead Unluck, and everyone is calling Dandadan a romance. So when you compare this to something like, say, Chainsaw Man, it's easy to see why some people might prefer Dandadan. Chainsaw Man certainly deals with a lot of romantic struggles, but because Denji is the main character, we see it through his perspective of chasing romance because he's looking for meaning in his own life. That is an individual struggle of looking for your own meaning and how that's influenced by society. That is a different kind of struggle from the one we see in Dandadan. In Dandadan, the characters influence each other for sure. In fact, that's kind of the whole point. But it's more than just influence. Okarun's growth is tied into Momo's, and Momo's growth is tied into Okarun's. Their arcs are intertwined in the sense that they are working towards the same goals, and each of their own goals is based on the other character. Because of this, they are inseparable. When Okarun is on his own, it always goes back to him thinking about Momo. And when we focus on Momo, she's always thinking about Okarun. Because of this, we get a very different kind of story. True, Chainsaw Man Part 2 does focus on Asa for a bit, but it's pretty clear that Denji is still the leading character. As a result, Chainsaw Man consists of a story that's mainly about personal growth. With Dandadan, you get a story that's about building off of your partner and growing together. Because of this, the whole story is about this dynamic. In the Evil Eye arc where Gigi is introduced, it starts with Gigi being presented as a threat to Okarun. So while it's full of creepy weirdos and giant monsters, the arc is really about Okarun dealing with his insecurity and learning to fight for his relationship with Momo. It's his character arc, but Momo is a huge part of it. This is why this trope works so well. Again, it's not inherently better than traditional stories. Chainsaw Man is a brilliant story that deals with themes of existentialism and societal influences. But there's a special place for stories where the goal isn't just to grow on your own, but to share your struggle with someone else and grow together. This is why romance stories are so popular. Kaguya-sama is popular for its comedy, but also because people love to watch the whole will they won't they thing and see the way these two characters push each other. Even a show like Komi-san, where Komi is clearly the main appeal. That is a show where Komi would not be the character she is later in the story without Tadano to push her. And Tadano wouldn't have the same kind of unspoken riz that Okarun does if he wasn't working so hard to help Komi and be a good person for her. It's the same reason I love Sign of Affection. In that show, Yuki is clearly our main character, but because it's a romance, we focus on her and Itsuomi. Itsuomi pushes Yuki out of her comfort zone, but she also introduces him to this brand new world of language and makes him feel special like he's never felt before, a dynamic that shares a lot in common with the one in Dandadan. But the beauty of Dandadan is that you get the best of both worlds. You get all the ball jokes and crazy alien monsters, but you also get the wholesome scenes and the mutual growth between Momo and Okarun. And that mutual growth influences the other characters in the story as well, and basically drives the entire plot, which is why this is really a special trope. It's not inherently better than other kinds of stories, but it is a nice break from the more typical shonen manga or stories like Chainsaw Man where we have to watch Denji suffer again and again. Dandadan is a romance that's also full of action. It's a story where both characters share the lead and grow with each other. And most importantly, it's a story that reminds us that we don't always have to be the main character of our own story. Sometimes we can write a new story together. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you describe this trope? Which style of story do you prefer? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like to join me for new discussions like this one, then make sure to check out my live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. In those live streams, I react to new chapters as well as discuss other anime and manga topics. Also, make sure to check out my other Dandadan videos in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.